Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's Commonwealth Bank Carbon Farming webinar. It is wonderful to have so many of you give us your time this afternoon and to talk all things carbon. My name is Natasha Greenwood, and as the General Manager for Agribusiness at CBA, I'm delighted to be your host this afternoon. Before we do get underway, I really wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today from right across Australia. For me, that's the land of the Kaurna people here on the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to those from across the land on which we're all dialing in from today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be joining us on the call. Welcome. Today, we're going to be hearing from a couple of our subject matter experts here at the Commonwealth Bank. I'd like to introduce Lachlan Finch and Carmel. Lachlan joins us from our Commodities, Carbon and Trading team, and he's been working with our agribusiness customers and carbon markets for a long period of time. Carmel also supports our agribusiness customers and leads all of the work that we do around ESG, carbon and agribusiness strategy. So it's terrific to have them both on the line today. I know that they are going to be very excited to share their experiences, their insights and their learnings around what we're seeing on the ground across Australia in relation to carbon. Commonwealth Bank has proudly supported Australian agribusinesses for over 100 years. And we're absolutely committed to supporting our customers as we all collectively transition to a lower carbon future. We do recognise, and it's important to note though, that everyone will be having different goals in relation to the transition economy and how they move forward to a lower carbon environment, and that everybody is actually starting from a different point in time. But regardless of your goals and where you might be on that journey, we are here to help. And it's really important that we take the opportunity through webinars like today to share our experiences, our insights, our knowledge, and also the range of solutions that we have in place to help you get started. So it's a really great place to start today's carbon conversation. So we're going to start almost right at the beginning. And we know that there are many of you who will have a different degree of knowledge about carbon, but we really want to give everybody the opportunity to hear right from where we start. So Lachlan, welcome this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really going to start with you. And I'd really love for you to share, when we talk about carbon markets and carbon, what do we really mean?
Thanks, Natasha, and g'day everyone. It's brilliant to have so many people tuning in today. So big question to begin with. I could definitely use up the whole 45 minutes just on this question, but I won't, of course. So look, carbon markets are in a really broad sense. They are structures that have been created by public and private institutions with the aim of commodifying atmospheric carbon and other greenhouse gas equivalents and allowing them to be valued, to carry a price, and ultimately to be traded. So I know that's a very sort of dry theoretical answer. Practically, what does that mean? Well, broadly, we like to categorize them into two streams. So on the one hand, we've got compliance markets driven by governments generally. And on the other hand, we've got voluntary markets, which are privately constructed. So compliance markets are essentially a tool. They're implemented by governments to reduce overall emissions of economies around the globe. And that's generally in an attempt to meet international climate commitments like the Paris Agreement. They generally involve some form of cap and trade scheme where carbon credits, or the units in this market, are created to place a price on each tonne of emitted carbon. And then the big emitters are regulated such that excessive pollution requires a commensurate purchasing of those credits. So the most prominent compliance market that people on this call might be familiar with would be the European Emissions Trading Scheme. So that's administered by the EU. It's very well established. It's highly financialized. It's a cap and trade scheme. The supply is controlled by the government. And then there are certain participants in that economy that are obliged to purchase and surrender these certificates if they emit beyond a certain allowable threshold. So that's compliance markets, carbon markets. On the other hand, there are also voluntary markets. And in some ways, these can be thought of as the reverse. So they are primarily not administered by sovereign governments. They're generally constructed by private entities in conjunction with international non-government organisations as well. And these markets are designed to recognise and commodify the opposite, and that's taking carbon out of the atmosphere or preventing it from being emitted at all in the first place. So many of those tuning in today have probably seen some sort of news coverage in relation to these international markets at some point in the past 6-12 months. And that is because there is a very spirited discourse at the moment around the best measures to ensure effectiveness and integrity of these markets, so they're continuously improving. But the reality is that they are growing enormously. And this is driven largely by increasing decarbonisation commitments from institutions of all sizes, as well as individual consumers. They're making their own decisions about how to reduce or offset their emissions, as well as getting huge amounts of pressure from stakeholders across their value chain. So that's shareholders and investors, but it's also suppliers, and some people on this call might have had these experiences. It's from consumers, it's from governments, and in some cases, it's even from some financiers across their supply chain. So where does that leave the Australian context? Well, in standard Aussie fashion, we've sort of disregarded the customary way of doing things. We've gone ahead and created a carbon market that is pretty unique. It's quite different. It's a bit of a blend of those compliance and voluntary markets that I spoke about, but I can run through more of that in due course in the webcast, I think. Just looking at the timing now, that's probably a strong overview to begin with. And Natasha, before I crack on, maybe we can ground the discussion in a bit more of the ag side of things. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, that's terrific. Thanks, Lachlan, and a great way to get us started. Look, I know that many of those on the call today are already going to be having some questions based on what you've said just in the opening few minutes. So for all of you that are on the call today, we will be asking a series of questions to both our panellists. But if you have a question, please use the Ask a Question button on your screen, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. If we don't get to them during the course of today, we will try and respond separately when we publish the webcast post this event. I think a couple of the things that you highlighted there, Lachlan, are really important. Why are we even talking about carbon? Well, because the momentum is shifting. And certainly one of the things that we have seen over the last 12 months is that momentum is shifting quickly. And what we are seeing is that this is not necessarily being regulatory or government-led, as might be the case internationally. In Australia, this is being supply chain-led. This is being consumer-led. This is being industry-led. But importantly, it's being producer-led. And I think that's an important note maybe to throw to you, Carmel, particularly as we think about farming and agribusiness. You know, what is the role of carbon on farm? And why is carbon so important?
Thanks, Tash. Well, this is the really incredible part of the story. Carbon is an essential ingredient to healthy, functioning agricultural landscapes. And the world's got a big problem at the moment, is that there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it needs a sink to put it into, and agriculture needs more carbon in its landscape. So Australian soils are very old and depleted of carbon, and carbon plays an incredibly important role in a healthy, functioning agricultural system. So one of the things it does is it creates structure in the soil. And so that really helps with preventing soil being degraded. And with that structure, it allows more moisture to penetrate through the soil and more oxygen and the free flow of nutrients. And so therefore, the water holding capacity of soil actually improves when you have higher soil carbon levels. So in terms of being as prepared as you can be for drought or lasting, last into drought and first out, if your capacity of your soils is really uplifted in that regard, it's a great outcome for the farmer. And also important is that carbon is essential for feeding the soil biology in soil, which plays an incredibly important role in finding the nutrients that plants need. So that's why we see this high correlation between healthy soil and high carbon levels. And so this function of feeding the biology so that they can feed the plants really leads to the productivity improvements that we see on farm for farmers that are able to get more carbon into their soil. Carbon markets are a way of bringing finance to farmers to enable them to invest in the practice changes that help them get more carbon into their soil. So this is why carbon markets are actually exciting. And this is before you potentially even earn an income from selling carbon credits. It's finance to help you make practice changes to make your landscape more productive and drought resilient. I just find that story really exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carmel. And I think Carmel and I and Lachlan are fortunate enough to be spending our working weeks out in regional Australia talking to farmers about how they are implementing practice change. And I think one of the things that's been incredibly interesting as we've been having those conversations is that you can be sustainable and profitable. It doesn't need to be an or conversation. It can be an and conversation. And Carmel, I think you've highlighted there that what we are seeing with some of the customers that we're working with that are starting to implement sustainable farming practices or think about how they might actually move towards a lower carbon footprint, that they are actually able to generate productivity uplift, which leads to profitability uplift, therefore giving them sustainability, profitability and productivity. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later on in today's discussion. So Lachlan, when we talk about carbon markets, Carmel's touched on it there, that carbon markets are a way that we can actually help farmers and bring together capital. Really important way that we bring together buyers and sellers. So you mentioned that Australia actually created our own carbon market. So I'm going to ask you to share a little bit about the Australian carbon market environment and why is it a little bit different? What makes an Australian carbon credit that little bit special?
Sure. So look, recall earlier I said Australia had a bit of a blend. So what I meant by that is we have a regulatory market, we do, where the biggest emitters in this country are obliged to surrender ACCUs or Australian Carbon Credit Units if they emit over a government legislated emissions threshold. That system is called the safeguard mechanism. So that's a compliance element. But the way that those credits are generated actually looks a lot more like an international market. So that mentioning before, where you're recognizing the actual drawing down of carbon from the atmosphere, or you're preventing it from being emitted in the first place. The difference, of course, in this instance is that it is being administered and regulated by the government. There is a specific agency within the government that regulates it. It's called the Clean Energy Regulator. So, and this is very crucial for the ag landscape and managed land in general. So in practical terms, that looks like the regulator has a range of methodologies and a stringent set of requirements on what eligible activities will be get you ACCUs and how to measure those activities and the various reporting requirements that are involved. And if you fully comply, then you'll be credited with a volume of certificates called Australian Carbon Credit Units. So each ACCU represents a tonne of carbon that you have sequestered or abated under one of these methodologies. Those credits can then be kept by that producer. They can be surrendered to the regulator to offset against that producer's emissions if they so wish. They can be sold to compliant entities who are captured under those government regulations that I mentioned. They could even be sold to entities who aren't even regulated, but who voluntarily decide that they want to offset their emissions footprint. And we are seeing an increased trend of that occur as well. So the marketplace, as you mentioned, Natasha, that marketplace of buying and selling ACCUs is actually still very much in its infancy in this country. So it's largely happening through brokers, or it's happening in a fashion that we would term at the bank over the counter, which simply means it's being privately negotiated. So they're privately negotiated sales between counterparties. And I can almost hear the typing in the chat box saying, what are the methodologies? What activities are eligible? So, and this is definitely how I run over time. So I'm going to keep it really high level, and I don't want to send anyone to sleep by getting too technical. I'll just touch on the key ones I think that are very relevant to agriculture in particular and managed land. So There are a range of opportunities for the land sector to sequester carbon, as Carmel already touched on, just as a business as usual production state. There's also opportunities to track and measure additional carbon that's being sequestered through land managed change, and ACCUs can be issued from the regulator for those. So these methods include regenerating native vegetation that's been suppressed through human-induced activities. So doing things like reducing grazing pressure on historically quite heavily grazed pastoral land, fencing off particular areas to allow regrowth to occur, or managing regrowth, etc., etc. Soil carbon has really picked up momentum in recent years, and I'm sure many listeners on the call have heard that term. In terms of both interest, it's picked up, but in terms of practical registrations as well. So that's basically sequestering carbon into the soil via pastures, measuring that impact over time. There are deliberate environmental plantings where you're allocating land entirely to revegetation, so it's natural habitat restoration. There's reducing methane emissions through dietary additives for beef cattle and milking cows, and so many more. Okay, so I'm really only scratching the surface here, and I would encourage anyone on the call who's listening to, if you are keen to dive into the details and the opportunities for the land sector in Australia, go straight to the source. So I'd advise looking at the website of the Clean Energy Regulator and checking out all of the listed methodologies. And I think I'll leave it there. Back to you, Natasha.
Yeah. Thanks, Lachlan. And I think a couple of things that you've touched on there are really important. In terms of our marketplace in Australia, one credit, not all credits are actually equal. So there are a range of opportunities to either buy or sell credits. We do have an Australian marketplace, but it is still in its infancy. But it has a very strong supporting regulatory environment, which is managed by the Clean Energy Regulator. And that website, we'd highly recommend a look. One of the really interesting things to do on that website is to have a look at projects that might be registered in your area. So there's a map functionality on the website that you can actually have a look and see, okay, well, who else might be doing a carbon project in my area? When was that registered, and what are they actually doing? Carmel, I think you and I, we talked about earlier in the discussion that we recognise that all of our customers, and our farmers in particular, are all going to have different goals in relation to transitioning to a low carbon future, and will be starting from a different place. And that will be dependent on the nature of their business, the sector that they're operating in, their location, their geography, and in some cases the maturity or needs of their business. So I think this would be a really great opportunity for you to share with some of the people on the call that we have today. What are you seeing our farmers do today in this area, and how are they actually getting started?
Yeah, thanks, Tash. I thought I'd just kick off by picking up on a point that Lachlan was making. There are a range of methods, not just in agriculture, but also right across other sectors of the economy. But why are we talking so much about agriculture and carbon markets? Well, because predominantly the majority of the registered projects are in the agriculture and vegetation methods. So there's undoubtedly so much more interest in carbon projects at the moment. We're definitely seeing that. I mean, you just need to look at the agenda of any event or webinar these days, and carbon markets usually feature on it. We're seeing a lot of knowledge building. So farmers are very curious. They're investing time to understand what is actually a complex market. I think we should be clear that this is not something you pick up overnight, like anything in farming. And particularly what they're thinking about is what are the practice changes that might be right for their farming strategy, for their farming family, because sequestering carbon into landscapes comes from the practice changes you make, and they need to fit with your business strategy and your family. So there's a lot of interest in soil carbon projects, and one of the reasons for that is because the agricultural enterprise can carry on over the top of the carbon project. And as we said earlier, carbon really can enhance the productivity of the underlying agricultural enterprise in the first place. So we're seeing a lot of research, we're seeing a lot of goal setting and practice change investigation. Equally, farmers are thinking a lot about who they would work with should they undertake a carbon project. There's a lot of new organisations now operating and supporting people undertaking projects. So that's a bit of a process to go through. I should mention that there is an eligible interest holder consent process that you should be aware of. People are investigating that if they have debt, if there are traditional owners involved in their land title and so on. There are a couple of examples. So that's a process that needs to be understood. And then finally, legal advice. So we're seeing people, and importantly, they should be really understanding their legal obligations. There are contracts involved in carbon projects, and you really need to be eyes wide open, knowing what you're going into. So there's some of the things, but overall, just heaps of activity and interest.
There is. Thanks so much, Carmel. We're really enjoying the opportunity to talk to a number of our farming customers around how they're thinking about transitioning to a lower carbon footprint, what practices they're looking at putting in place on their farm, or how they're thinking about moving forward, and then in turn how we can actually support them do that. I think one of the things that we talk about often for you, Lachlan, is that as we think about agriculture as being an opportunity to generate credits, there are those also that will be looking to purchase credits, which is why we have a marketplace. As with any marketplace, there might be some volatility. So when we think about what the future outlook might be for the value of carbon credits, what factors might impact the market outlook for the value of particularly, I guess, an ACCU?
Sure. So, look, I think the best way to start is probably with the current market conditions. But as I mentioned previously, it isn't as financialized or as liquid a market, just given its size and how relatively new it is compared to more established, for instance, agricultural commodity markets. So that pricing visibility, even that is probably at a lower threshold. So unlike something like the CME wheat futures that you can look up online, every second of the day exactly how much that futures contract is going to be worth, or even how much the spot contract today is. That isn't the case with the carbon market. There is some published data that participants in the call might be able to jump online and just take a look at. There's data that you can access if you pay for it as well. But what I'm trying to describe is it is not as liquid or an established market. So sort of opaqueness and general lack of liquidity, that's a big factor. But that's the current sort of market conditions. When we talk about overall impacts and what's shaping the future of the market, there have been a couple of really big regulatory or government changes over the past 8 months. It's been actually quite a dynamic time in the carbon market in Australia. So in the change of government in the middle of last year, there was a snap review of the ACCU market in Australia commissioned by the new Labor government under Anthony Albanese and the responsible minister, Chris Bowen. What that report was designed to do was assess the market, assess its integrity, the different methods that are involved, and it was led by former Chief Scientist Ian Chubb. And that was actually handed down at the start of last year. There's quite a range of recommendations that are being undertaken and implemented by the regulator, including tightening up aspects such as measurement, regulatory governance requirements, all these sorts of things. So increased participation, increased investment, increased scrutiny on the market, which is most welcome, is actually leading to gradual market improvement. So that's one significant change that's currently afoot. Another is the introduction of a revamped and re-strengthened safeguard mechanism. And I mentioned this prior in the webcast. So that's that requirement for the largest emitters in this country to purchase ACCUs, many of which are generated and supplied from the land sector in Australia and other sectors such as waste management as well. So a requirement for those emitters, if they emit over what is now actually much more stringent baselines and requirements for decarbonisation, if they breach those, then they have to buy ACCUs. So that's a big dynamic affecting the natural balance. And this is what I'm sort of driving to is in terms of market outlook, it's all about supply and demand, and those big dynamics drive every big market. It's just that those supply and demand dynamics are very unique here. So on the supply side of the Aussie carbon market, I touched on some different methodologies. There are new methods being developed all the time, and that is going to be a natural a natural driver of how much supply of sequestered carbon can come into the market, how much can be verified by the regulator, ticked off and credited to producers. There's new methods being developed, such as, for instance, on our coastal areas across the country, blue carbon, so to speak, including agricultural managed land on the coast. There is a question mark with regards to supply on exactly what the uptake of carbon projects are going to be across the country. It's not a given that every agricultural operator is going to decide, yep, this is right for me, and step in. Just as with any business enterprise, it's quite difficult to forecast that. So that's a big factor that is currently uncertain. The amount of inventory that is going to be used that's currently stored in the accounts. The way you store a carbon credit in Australia is the Australian National Registry of Emissions Units. So how much of the current inventory that's currently there is going to be used or intends to be used? How much will it be sold? So these are the sorts of questions that are driving the supply equation. On the demand side, unfortunately, it's just as complicated. So I already spoke about, we've got the safeguard mechanism. How effective are the biggest emitters in this country going to be at decarbonising and meeting those goals that the government's thrust upon them? Because if they're very effective at doing that, there might be a relatively low demand for ACCUs. If they find it a real challenge, then there could be more of a demand for ACCUs, which will tip the scales a bit. There's a question mark over voluntary commitments. How much of the business community and industry in Australia, how much even individual consumers are going to be wanting to buy offsets in the coming years? We are seeing increased decarbonisation commitments every week. We probably all read them in the news. But how much of that is going to translate into buying offsets? There are varied opinions. So that's going to impact demand as well. There's even larger government regulations at play, like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the like, that are going to have an impact here too. So when we talk about, for instance, what's going to be the future price of carbon, every different analyst has a different expectation. And what we probably try to refocus, at least our clients, on thinking about is just the supply and demand dynamics. And in the first instance, is it right for them to decide to get involved, either as a potential producer of carbon certificates or as a potential buyer of them as well?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lachlan. I think it really highlights the importance of talking to a specialist. So for all of our audience this afternoon, I hope we're answering some of your questions. I can see some of them coming through on the chat now, and we'll get to those in a moment. But as you can see, we've got some deep expertise around carbon markets, and we'd really encourage a conversation post our event today if you do have some specific questions that you'd like to talk to us about. I think moving away from maybe the macro view, I'd actually like to zoom in a little bit now, Carmel, if we can, and I'd love to actually share some stories. So we're seeing a range of initiatives happening across Australia, and we're also seeing a range of solutions being put in place by our customers as they start to think about how they might engage in the transition economy and how they might sequester carbon. So I'd love you to talk about maybe a couple of stories that you have or a couple of examples that you have, and also to talk a little bit about how CBA is actually helping farmers who do sequester or reduce their carbon footprint, what we can do to help.
Yeah, thanks, Tash. One thing I'd really just call out, if it's not sort of coming across to the audience already, is that Commonwealth Bank really understands how important these markets are going to be in the new environment where climate change is such an important part of our world and addressing those issues. And so we're working really, really hard to be ready to support our customers in that regard. And one example of that is when a farmer or a project is being registered and there is debt on the title, for example, of the property. The bank, as an eligible interest holder, needs to provide approval for that project to go ahead. And that's a process that we've invested a lot in, making sure that we can turn that around really, really quickly. And that's really important for farmers so that their project isn't held up. So, that's one example of things that we're really doing to try and make ourselves really ready to support this market, because we understand how important it is. As Tash said, we do have carbon specialists. That's another way that we're really sort of building our capabilities to support people as they, engage with us on carbon farming. We have our bankers who would love to talk about this at any opportunity. And events like today, we're really trying to put together as much education to support awareness and knowledge build as we can. We speak at a lot of events. We prepare a lot of written material that we make available as well. So there's just a couple of examples of things we're doing. Plenty more to come. The most exciting one for me is the CBA Agri Green Loan, which is a purpose-built solution developed by the Agri team to support farmers in particular. It is discounted finance for approved eligible purposes, which we know deliver environmental benefits. And of course, carbon farming through the practice changes we've outlined really improves our soil productivity, for example, and many other benefits of getting more carbon into your landscape. So therefore, the Agri Green Loan is immediately eligible for supporting carbon projects and the practice change to sequester that carbon. So to give you a few examples of how Agri Green Loans have been used in that sort of context, we have a cattle producer in central Queensland, so not the easiest country to farm. They're undertaking a soil carbon project, but because the rainfall's so low, it's harder to sequester carbon in that environment. So you have to do it over a really large number of hectares, i.e. at scale, to make it economic. And so those soil sampling costs to get going on a soil carbon project in that part of the world are not immaterial. And we were able to support that farmer with that upfront investment to get into that carbon project and make the practice changes to sequester that carbon, which were a lot about rehydrating the landscape and managing compaction. So that's one example. Moving down to New South Wales, we have another cattle farmer who used our Agri Green Loan. The practice change that they were interested to sequester more carbon into their soil was rotational grazing, so time-based cell grazing. So that Agri Green Loan was not only used for the project setup cost, but for the wire and water investment to set up that sort of style of grazing. And also converting to sort of more organic-based fertilisers as part of that system. And then the third example I would use, unfortunately, I've just chosen three grazing farmers. This is Victorian farmers, and they've used our Agri Green Loan to do a pasture renovation program. So to support soil carbon sequestration, they've gone with a multi-species pasture renovation, which brings more diversity into the soil and really amplifies the effect of getting more carbon into the soil. So the final point I'd make is that we also have some solutions coming out of Lachlan's world. So very, very specifically also designed to support carbon projects and people undertaking them, but I will leave that for Lachlan to talk more about.
Yeah, thanks, Carmel. And I think just to echo your points, we really want to take an approach of supporting farmers in terms of whatever initiative they might be undertaking. And there are a range of solutions. So Carmel's talked about Agri Green Loan, which we would describe as typically being a great solution for a sustainable farming practice that's around CapEx on farm. We've done really small Agri Green Loans. We've done really large Agri Green Loans. We've also done Agri Green Loans in all sectors. So Carmel's really used the examples of some grazing customers there, but we've done them in horticulture, we've done them in cropping, dryland farming. So we really encourage you to talk to us about what you might be doing on farm. We'll be able to give you an idea fairly quickly as to whether or not it's eligible for an Agri Green Loan. And if it is, we can talk you through that process. Agri Green Loan, though, isn't the only solution that we have available to support you on your journey towards transitioning to a lower carbon future. For some of you, you may just be purchasing eligible equipment or machinery on farm that we may be able to provide you with an energy efficient asset finance arrangement. This is also discounted finance and is really useful when you're actually buying tractors, you might be buying sprayers, you might be buying pivots, you might be buying things that actually we can do under an asset finance arrangement. I think the thing that we're starting to get a little bit more inquiry about, and which we're really proud of actually, because we're one of the first banks to be talking about how we might use this new style of finance. So I'm not going to steal Lachlan's thunder because I really want him to talk us through this example. But we do know that when farmers are thinking about how they might engage in either a productivity initiative or a sustainability initiative that is considered eligible under the methodologies, they might be doing it for the purposes of either generating credits, which they intend to divest themselves of, or they might be doing it for the purposes of being able to demonstrate their own sustainability or transition credentials, so insetting or offsetting. So I might actually get you to talk a little bit about that first, Lachlan, because I can see there's a couple of questions about that as well. So I might start with, can you just talk about the difference between insetting carbon and offsetting carbon? And then actually lead on to how we might actually be able to support farmers who are specifically thinking about generating credits and potentially the pre-purchase of credits.
Sure, certainly can do. So on the point of insetting versus offsetting, so I'll start with offsetting, probably more broadly known. It's where you take a measurement of all the emissions of your business or your enterprise or your organization. And once that's calculated in any given year, if you want to offset those emissions, you do so through buying a carbon certificate in Australia. That can be an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, an ACCU, and surrender that with the regulator. And then you can be, in the Australian context, certified under something called the Climate Active Standard. That's something that is administered by the government, and that can certify you as carbon neutral for that given reporting period. So you're taking a measurement of your emissions, you're calculating that tonnage, you're buying the requisite number of carbon units to cover that, and you're surrendering them, you're cancelling those. That's offsetting. Insetting is where you are creating those certificates yourself, and you're deciding to use those certificates against your overall emissions profile of your business. So it is a bit of a nuance. So instead of you procuring them for somewhere else, you're making them yourself. Now, what you're essentially doing there is you're moving away from a model where maybe you'd just be measuring the overall output of your business in an emissions sense. Perhaps you'd be close to net neutral or carbon neutral. Maybe you'd fall short. Maybe you're over the other edge and you're actually sequestering more carbon than you're emitting. But in any case, you're deciding to register it under a government scheme, get accredited with the certificates, be credited with those, and then you've got flexibility on how to use them. And so that's often the draw card that we're seeing in a commercial sense when clients are choosing to inset. What they're doing is they're getting accredited under a standard, they're receiving certificates, and often they decide to do so because it gives them flexibility. If they meet certain targets or their goals change, then they can sell those certificates, monetize them over time. Or if they decide they want to, for instance, launch a carbon neutral product, a specific supply line, then they can do that with the certificates that they've created, and they've got an inset product. So hopefully that gives a good overview of that distinction. Onto sort of what we're doing as a group. So I agree, Natasha, it does make us very proud to be able to talk about all of the work they're undertaking in this space, because it really is market leading, and I'm very glad that you asked about it, so I can talk about it briefly. So in a very basic sense, we are a market maker. So for clients who are looking to offset their emissions, who can't get access to a carbon market, or really want a trusted partnership like their bank to give them access to the market, we're doing that. So we can sell offsets to clients who need them. We can be very bespoke about the way that we procure it, with very specific guidelines on grades and even geography, where they're created, all these sorts of things. For clients who don't or don't have the capacity to open an account with the regulator, we can even surrender credits on their behalf. We can sell them, and it's called a sale and surrender. So that's an arrangement that we can have. In the same way, for clients who are already underway, they're undertaking a project, all they would like is market access. We can give competitive bids for our clients to purchase certificates off them if they do decide that they want to monetize ACCUs that they're creating through a methodology that's right for them. So that's at a very, very base level. For specifically suppliers, you mentioned, Natasha. So the two big barriers that we notice a large bulk of our clients came to us with when it comes to creating projects, one was upfront capital, and then the other was managing market risk of what is essentially a volatile commodity, just like a lot of agricultural commodities, the price is changing all the time. So on the upfront capital part, we can lend in a traditional sense, done a lot of work as a group, and we continue to do work on being able to value carbon streams, include them in a standard cash flow model. And a lot of the work we do here in markets really feeds into that overall capability of our group. In a more specific sense, and I think you were referencing this one before, Natasha, we can do things like prepay for future years' streams of carbon certificates. We can not only do something like lock in prices into the future, agree to buy a certain number of certificates off a client who's deciding to create them for a number of years into the future to give them certainty over pricing for maybe just a portion, 10, 20, 30% of the credits they are going to be generating. We can also prepay those cash flows on day one, potentially to cover a large capital outlay if the setup costs of a project are inhibitive or too expensive for a client. And that is a really efficient way that we can demonstrate to our clients that we're in with them when they're starting a carbon project, that not only will we help them manage the risk, but we'll also lend in a really unique and innovative way to allow them to get involved when otherwise potentially they wouldn't have been able to. So that's a really innovative product. An example of the employment of that was last year. We funded the acquisition of a pastoral lease in WA purely through this prepayment mechanism. So we purchased a portion of the carbon credits coming off a project in WA. For 5 years, we committed to this purchase. We prepaid those funds, and in doing so, allowed the actual acquisition of this pastoral lease. And that was a really, really awesome milestone for us last November. A lot of reverse inquiries around that one because it is quite an innovative product. And the last point I'd make as well is we're not just in it to try to make markets for clients. If people decide they're just not sure what they want to do yet, they're creating certificates, they want to keep them on their balance sheet and own them, we've also got a whole range of products where we're working on recognizing that value, understanding that they want to keep their flexibility and lending against those credits that sit on their balance sheet.
Hopefully what you've heard Lachlan and Carmel talk about in terms of the way that we are supporting customers in relation to their own transition activities is varied. So we'd love to talk to you about what you're doing and how we might be able to help. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Carmel. I can't believe the webinar and this conversation has gone by so quickly. So to wrap us up, before I close out for today, I'd really love to hear from you. We've talked about a lot of things today. We've talked about carbon markets. We've talked about what an ACCU is. We've talked about insetting and offsetting. We've talked about some examples around what some of our customers are doing. And we've talked about the shift in momentum around this conversation and what we are seeing on the ground. People are going to have a lot of questions. You mentioned yourself, we're seeing a lot of curiosity in this area. So post this call, if people really wanted to find out more or understand where they could go to get more information, what are the best resources that we're seeing out there? Where can people go to get some help?
Well, I'd love it if they came and talked to us. Definitely at some point talking to your bank is advisable. But look, there's just, like anything in nature that's related to nature, diversity is key. So talk to as many people as you can. If you're in producer groups, it's worth raising it there. If you're in a land care group, if you're in any kind of group, if your neighbour's thinking about it, have a yarn with them. If you know a farmer that's doing a carbon project, definitely grab them for a cup of tea and talk to them. You can talk to carbon project developers. They will all happily talk to you, give you some introductory amount of time for free. You should also go to their websites. There's a lot of information that they put up. As Lachlan mentioned, the Clean Energy Regulator that administers the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is the wacky name for our carbon market, there's an enormous amount of information there. So I think it's really, and the really important one is to talk to your family. If you're going to go down a road like this, particularly with succession, so important in farming family businesses, just really important to engage your family as well. So yeah, there's a lot of people to talk to and there's plenty of information out there.
There is indeed. And, we'd love to have the opportunity to speak to you. Unfortunately, that brings us almost to the end of our time. And I'm sorry we haven't got to all of the questions that have been posted in the chat. In closing today, I'd really like to share a couple of key messages. What we are seeing right across the country is a shift in momentum. That momentum is steadily moving from curiosity towards intent and from intent towards action. This movement is really being driven by an ecosystem of stakeholders, supply chain participants, consumers, industry, and of course, producers. And we really want to be here to support you wherever you are in that journey today, and whatever your objective might be, we have a solution that will help fit. CBA is committed to supporting the transition economy, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about what you're interested in doing. On that note, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We've loved having you with us. If you do have further questions, please reach out to your local banker and we'd be delighted to have a one-on-one conversation with you. Have a wonderful evening and we'll speak to you all soon. But bye for now.